I was in something of a bind, for I really could not allow myself to be stampeded into saying that I was a Christian. Now? Nothing. This was not enough. I'm a writer. I like doing things alone. I heard myself saying this. Elijah smiled at me. I don't anyway, I said finally. Think about it a great deal. Elijah said to his right, I think he ought to think about it all the deal. And with this, the table agreed. But there was nothing malicious or condemnatory in it. I had the stifling feeling that they knew I belonged to them, but knew that I did not know it yet, that I remained unready, and that they were simply waiting, patiently and with assurance, for me to discover the truth for myself. For where else, after all, could I go? I was black, and therefore a part of Islam, and would be saved from the Holocaust awaiting the white world, whether I would or no. My weak, deluded scruples could avail nothing against the iron word of the prophet. I felt that I was back in my father's house, as indeed in a way I was, and I told Elijah that I did not care if white and black people married, and that I had many white friends. I would have no choice if it came to it but to perish with them, for, I said to myself, but not to Elijah, I love a few people, and they love me, and some of them are white, and isn't love more important than color? Elijah looked at me with great kindness and affection, great pity, as though he were reading my heart, and indicated, skeptically, that I might have white friends, or think I did, and they might be trying to be decent now, but their time was up. It was almost though he were saying, they had their chance, man, and they goofed. And I looked around the table. I certainly had no evidence to give them that would outweigh Elijah's authority, or the evidence of their own lives, or the reality of the streets outside. Yes, I knew 2 or 3 people, white, whom I would trust with my life. And I knew a few others, white, who were struggling as hard as they knew how, and with great effort and sweat and risk, to make the world more human. But how could I say this? One cannot argue with anyone's experience or decision or belief. All my evidence would be thrown out of court as irrelevant to the main body of the case, for I could cite only exceptions. The South Side proved the justice of the indictment. The state of the world proved the justice of the indictment. Everything else, stretching back throughout recorded time, was merely a history of those exceptions who had tried to change the world and had failed. Was this true? Had they failed? How much depended on the point of view? For it would seem that a certain category of exceptions never failed to make the world worse, that category precisely for whom power is more real than love. And yet power is real, and many things, including very often love, cannot be achieved without it. In the eeriest way possible, I suddenly had a glimpse of what white people must go through at a dinner table when they are trying to prove that Negroes are not subhuman. I had almost said, after all, well, take my friend Mary, and very nearly descended to a catalogue of those virtues that gave Mary the right to be alive. And in what hope? That Elijah and the others would nod their heads solemnly and say at least, well, she's all right, but the others. And I looked again at the young faces around the table, and I looked back at Elijah, who was saying that no people in history had ever been respected who had not owned their land. And the table said, yes, that's right. I could not deny the truth of this statement, for everyone else is, a nation with a specific location and a flag, even these days the Jew. It is only the so-called American Negro who remains trapped, disinherited, and despised in a nation that has kept him in bondage for nearly 400 years and is still unable to recognize him as a human being. And the black Muslims, along with many people who are not Muslims, no longer wish for a recognition so grudging and, should it ever be achieved, so tardy. Again, it cannot be denied that this point of view is abundantly justified by American Negro history. It is galling indeed to have stood so long, hat in hand, waiting for Americans to grow up enough to realize that you do not threaten them. On the other hand, how is the American Negro now to form himself into a separate nation? For this, and not only from the Muslim point of view, which seemed to be his only hope of not perishing in the American backwater and being entirely and forever forgotten, as though he had never existed at all and his travail had been for nothing. Elijah's intensity and the bitter isolation and disaffection of these young men and the despair of the streets outside had caused me to glimpse dimly what may now seem to be a fantasy, although, in an age so fantastical, I would hesitate to say precisely what a fantasy is. Let us say that Muslims were to achieve the possession of the 6 or 7 states that they claim are owed to Negroes by the United States as back payment for slave labor. Clearly, the United States would never surrender this territory on any terms whatever, unless it found it impossible, for whatever reason, to hold it, unless, that is, the United States were to be reduced as a world power exactly the way and at the same degree of speed that England has been forced to relinquish her empire. It is simply not true, and the state of her ex-colonies proves this, that England always meant to go. If the states were southern states, and the Muslims seem to favor this, then the borders of a hostile Latin America would be raised, in effect, to, say, Maryland. Of the American borders on the sea, one would face toward a powerless Europe, and the other toward an untrustworthy and non-white East. And on the north, after Canada, there would only be Alaska, which is a Russian border. The effect of this would be that the white people of the United States and Canada would find themselves marooned on a hostile continent, with the rest of the white world probably unwilling and certainly unable to come to their aid. All this is not, to my mind, the most imminent of possibilities. But if I were a Muslim, this is the possibility that I would find myself holding in the center of my mind and driving toward. And if I were a Muslim, I would not hesitate to utilize, or indeed to exacerbate, the social and spiritual discontent that reigns here, for at the very worst, I would merely have contributed to the destruction of a house I hated, and it would not matter if I perished too. One has been perishing here so long. And what were they thinking around the table? "I've come," said Elijah, "to give you something which can never be taken away from you." How solemn the table became then, and how great a light rose in the dark faces. This is the message that is spread through streets and tenements and prisons, through the narcotics wards, and past the filth and sadism of mental hospitals, to a people from whom everything has been taken away, including, most crucially, their sense of their own worth. People cannot live without this sense. They will do anything whatever to regain it. This is why the most dangerous creation of any society is that man who has nothing to lose. You do not need 10 such men. One will do. And Elijah, I should imagine, has had nothing to lose since the day he saw his father's blood rush down and splash, so the legend has it, down through the leaves of a tree on him. But neither did the other men around the table have anything to lose. "Return to your true religion," Elijah has written. "Throw off the chains of the slave master, the devil, and return to the fold. Stop drinking his alcohol, using his dope. Protect your women, and forsake the filthy swine." I remembered my buddies of years ago in the hallways with their wine and their whiskey and their tears, in hallways still, frozen on the needle, and my brother saying to me once, "If Harlem didn't have so many churches and junkies, there'd be blood flowing in the streets." Protect your women. A difficult thing to do in a civilization sexually so pathetic that the white man's masculinity depends on a denial of the masculinity of the blacks. Protect your women. In a civilization that emasculates the male and abuses the female, and in which, moreover, the male is forced to depend on the female's breadwinning power. Protect your women. In the teeth of the white man's boast. We figured we're doing you folks a favor by pumping some white blood into your kids, and while facing the Southern shotgun and the Northern Billy. Years ago we used to say, "Yes, I'm black, goddammit, and I'm beautiful," in defiance, into the void. But now, African kings and heroes have come into the world, out of the past. the past that can now be put to the uses of power. And black has become a beautiful color, not because it is loved, but because it is feared. And this urgency on the part of American Negroes is not to be forgotten. As they watch black men elsewhere rise, the promise held out at last that they may walk the earth with the authority with which white men walk, protected by the power that white men shall have no longer, is enough, and more than enough, to empty prisons and pull God down from heaven. It has happened before, many times, before color was invented, and the hope of heaven has always been a metaphor for the achievement of this particular state of grace. The song says, "I know my robe's going to fit me well. I tried it on at the gates of hell." It was time to leave, and we stood in the large living room saying goodnight, with everything curiously and heavily unresolved. I could not help feeling that I had failed a test, in their eyes and in my own, or that I had failed to heed a warning. Elijah and I shook hands, and he asked me where I was going. Wherever it was, I would be driven there. Because when we invite someone here, he said, we take the responsibility of protecting him from the white devils until he gets wherever it is he's going. I was, in fact, going to have a drink with several white devils on the other side of town. I confess that for a fraction of a second I hesitated to give the address, the kind of address that in Chicago, as in all American cities, identified itself as a white address by virtue of its location. But I did give it, and Elijah and I walked out onto the steps, and one of the young men vanished to get the car. It was very strange to stand with Elijah for those few moments, facing those vivid, violent, so problematical streets. I felt very close to him, and really wished to be able to love and honor him as a witness, an ally, and a father. I felt that I knew something of his pain and his fury, and yes, even his beauty. Yet precisely because of the reality and the nature of those streets, because of what he conceived as his responsibility and what I took to be mine, we would always be strangers, and possibly, one day, enemies. The car arrived, a gleaming metallic, grossly American blue, and Elijah and I shook hands and said good night once more. He walked into his mansion and shut the door.